Good morning. My name is Petia Radeva. I have the pleasure to chair the session where we have our invited talk. This is Professor Xavier Boix, a research scientist from MIT, USA. Xavier Boix works as a research scientist at the Department of Brain and Cognitive Science at MIT since 2021. He's leading a group investigating biologically inspired machine learning. Xavier received a doctorate in machine learning from ETH Zurich in 2014 and completed his postdoc training at MIT in the Sinha Lab, Singapore, and also the Pathological Lab, where he was part of the Multidisciplinary Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines. Xavier develops an amazing research at developing theories that facilitate the next generation of learning machines by leveraging insights and tools from neuroscience points of view. His research lives at the intersection of theoretical machine learning, engineering of deep neural networks, and neuroscience, where many of us have a lot of questions, doubts, curiosities, and opinions. I'm very sure you will enjoy his talk as well as all discussions on these topics at the conference. So, Xavier, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Petia. Thanks a lot for the organizers for inviting me, for giving this opportunity to present this perspective. I think what last day and today, what we have mostly been seeing is how how machine learning is helping neuroscience. In here, we're going to see the arrow in the other direction, how neuroscience is helping and has helped machine learning. First of all, I'm sure I don't need to persuade you that the problem of intelligence is one of the most fascinating ones. What is intelligence, what is needed, what are its underlying principles, how can we reproduce it? Here with this audience working in neuroscience, I guess this is plenty of fascination about it. It's even arguable, it's maybe most fundamental problem in science, given that intelligence is needed for solving any of the other problems. So one approach to this question that has been I've been really engaged with is this idea that Richard Feynman put in some words. I don't understand what I cannot create. So in a way, one approach to understand intelligence is building intelligent machines, right? When you build a machine, it requires some clarity, it requires this dissecting and understanding some of the components, and it really sets the bar higher in a sense. So, and essentially machine learning tried to get at that, but in the last 10 years, as you guys know, there has been big advances in machine learning, and since early days, we expected that the day that we'll have really intelligent machines will actually understand intelligence. We are going to be getting closer and closer to that. But in the last 10 years, after all the impressive and incredible advances in machine learning, this approach has been said there are some doubts around it. So before starting explaining some of the research, I would like to set or go through some of the issues or lessons from deep learning, right? So the first lesson is the following, is that, well, we can build really intelligent machines. We can build maybe machines that we cannot even, we're not there yet, but at some point we are going to be able to build machines that are maybe indistinguishable from humans, right? They can pass the Turing test. But that wouldn't mean understand intelligence, right? So that core principle that drove artificial intelligence since early days, since it seems now there are doubts around it, right? So actually, Alan Turing, in the paper where he actually introduced the Turing test, at the end there is a very revealing section where he discusses about learning machines. What about the day, this is 1950, what about the day we can build a machine that can learn? And he points out that most likely we won't be able to understand it, right? So this idea that building and understanding might not be really the same, since early days has also been a doubt. But the machine learning community, the artificial intelligence community seem to have been ignoring this until maybe the last decade, right? So great progress in machine learning, but we're not maybe getting closer and understanding intelligence with that progress, right? And well, one would say, well, who cares, right? As long as we have great technology that do amazing things, who cares if we don't understand how that technology works internally, right? Well, that's great for some applications, right? But for some others, that maybe it's really really a blocker, right? Autonomous driving has been promised more than 5 years ago and still not here, and it's not going to be here, mostly because there are failures, since we don't get full insight about how these learning machines work internally, what they have learned, what are their decision-making strategies that have emerged in those machines. We cannot be safe deploying them to society. The same with surveillance, medical imaging, etc. Right? And just let me show you some failure modes. There are plenty of them if you Google online, but these are kind of quite striking. Pink elephant, no one has here a problem recognizing this is a pink elephant. You put into one of these neural networks that has never seen a pink elephant, and it just replies a dromedary, or you put a drawing, and the same, right? So some of those things that for humans seem quite obvious, those learning machines that maybe they are not familiar with this type of images, they miserably fail. And we as technologists, we have little insights about why they fail in those cases, right? And in autonomous driving, coming back to the example I put before, it seems that when you are in the road, there are many of those cases that we don't realize, but there are some sort of exceptions, and they are really rarely appear in training sets, and in those cases, machines fail, and autonomous driving is not here yet. Let me show you just a quick video. There is no one got injured here, but it's just simple example of one of the early crashes of Tesla in a road. There is a car in a very uncommon position there, and autonomous driving could not recognize as a car. As I said, this is just mock video. Don't worry, no one was injured, nothing happened, but just an example of something that happened in the road, something that for a human would be quite straightforward to recognize there is here a track in a weird position, we need to stop. Autonomous driving doesn't seem at that point to be able to recognize that. And like this, you can find many, many different cases, right? Machine learning has achieved a lot of success, but at the same time, there is a lot of worrying failures that we need to address, and we cannot do this at this point because we have little insights about how those machines internally work. Right? We can build them, but we don't have insights, we don't have theories that explain why they fail, why they work. Okay, the second lesson from deep learning, and that's maybe something that this community will be more familiar, is how these have changed the perspective of what is the role of machines in understanding intelligence, right? In the top, there is the classic vision, right, that the human brain is the target to understand intelligence. If we understand the human brain, we're going to actually understand intelligence. And deep learning or artificial neural networks, computational models serves as toy tools to develop hypotheses, to test hypotheses, to maybe to...
Así que has empezado a correr. El Apple Watch también ha empezado a hacer cosas nuevas.
Sí. Sometimes we don't understand machines and we get... Maybe the machine was trying to protest about my claims. Okay, how do you go back here? Okay. Right, and the other side of the arrow would be, well, we can develop machines inspired by biology. Artificial neural networks are actually come from brain science, right? The roots are in the 60s, people trying to mimic biological neurons and artificial neural networks. So most of the success in machine learning comes actually from neuroscience, right? Reinforcement learning is another example, right? So this is the classic way we have been seeing this, the relationship between machine learning and neuroscience. How deep learning has shifted our perspective. The fact that in some tasks like mathematics, chemistry, or video games, or many, many new tasks that we could not expect, in which machines would surpass human intelligence. So we slowly are seeing that machines is not just like something that, you know, at most we can imitate the human brain. We start realizing we are not alone. There are other forms of intelligence that we can create. These are different in some senses from humans. They are similar in some other senses from humans. But we cannot just keep this perspective that the human brain is the holy grail of intelligence and machines are just like something that at most someday we'll be able to mimic the human brain, but there are other algorithms that also can implement intelligence besides the human brain, right? And I'm seeing maybe the field start getting this sense, this Copernican principle, and maybe what we should aim in order to understand intelligence, not just understand the human brain, but get to some underlying principles for brains and machines. Given the differences and the similarities, and given machines, there are some tasks that can do much better than brains. Maybe we should consider them seriously and try to get also the understanding those machines, what are the underlying principles, given that we don't understand them. So just let me do a quick recap of what I just said. We need theories of deep learning. They are lacking. We don't understand deep learning. We can build it, but we don't understand it. First of all, of course, to do better artificial intelligence, we could maybe get at explaining those machines. We can maybe facilitate improvements. We can address all these issues we have been discussing. And second, because maybe we are going to be getting at some general principles of intelligence, both for biology and artificial intelligence. So that's a bit the motivation, and then you would say, okay, very cool, nice philosophy, okay, how do we go about it? Okay, so let's use science, and as a neuroscientist, it's not going to be surprising that, but from the machine learning perspective, that's something relatively new, something that is emerging maybe in the last few years, right? Machine learning comes from computer science and mathematics, and people, when want to explain something, they put a theorem to try to explain something, right? The first thing that they come to their minds is not to use science. Right? So what we are trying here to do is to use actually science to explain machine learning models, right? And I don't need to explain you with a scientific method, right? Guess, falsify, hypothesis, right? That's something that for machine learning, for mathematicians, sometimes it's like, it's different from what has been going on in the field of artificial intelligence. But the fact that I just want to highlight the fact of being falsifiable, right? These hypotheses always are susceptible to be wrong, to find a new experiment and dismiss. Right? And then all this testing that needs to be done, and this virtuous cycle that gets at more stronger generalizable hypothesis. And one particular strand of research that I'm very excited about is, well, in order to do this science, maybe we can just take what neuroscientists have been doing over decades and do it to learning machines. And that's what I've been working on in the last 5 years. Right? So it's relatively straightforward, I think, for neuroscientists to do this, and there are actually really interesting things you can do much easier than in biological brains, right? Artificial neural networks, you know, they don't, well, in principle, they don't feel pain. If you put them an electrode to them, you can do experiments as much as they want, that they don't get tired, right? You don't need to, at this point, I guess most people will agree that it seems there is no ethical issues to experiment with artificial neural networks. Right? And you would say, well, that seems a bit unreasonable. This is just a piece of software. Why would you do that? Right? It seems maybe you're wasting your time. Well, there is plenty of evidence that shows that there is a clear relationship, a clear resemblance between, of course, not perfect. There are also clear differences, but there's a clear resemblance between what you see in the neural activity of artificial neural networks, of deep learning, and the neural activity in the brain. I'm putting here the visual areas of the macaque, right? I'm going to be talking mostly about vision. Vision is in also the field I've been researching, and it's a prominent field inside artificial intelligence. And there is plenty of evidence showing that if you record some neural activity in the main areas of the ventral stream related to object recognition, and you compare it with neural activity that you can record in artificial neural networks, you see a certain degree of resemblance. Right? So because there is a resemblance, it doesn't seem such a bad idea to apply techniques that have been applied to study techniques and theories that have been used to explain also the ventral stream and visual areas. Maybe we can use them also to apply it here. Right? So quite straightforward. And I'm here showing just some data more clearly about this evidence. I thought that might be interesting, that this evidence comes also to the level of individual neurons. What you see here is some neuron recorded from before. Every dot here corresponds to a different image. This is a macaque looking at an image shown in a flash, and there is some neural recording in one individual neuron. And what I'm plotting here is the average firing rate. And then we went through the neural network, and we tried to find a neuron that resembles as much as possible to that recording, and we plot here again. We do exactly the same experiment. In this case, we look at the output of the neuron, of the artificial neuron. In this case, these are not spiking neurons, but the neuron has an output value between 0 and infinite, and you can interpret this as a spiking as the firing rate of the neuron. And then you compare them, and you find relatively high correlation. You can do this, and that's pretty common, and this is just another piece of evidence that this resemblance is not just an abstract level, but it can go up to the individual neural level in brains and machines. Okay, let's move forward. Why is also interesting to use those theories from neuroscience? Well, they are quite intuitive and manageable compared maybe to the theories that have been used classically in machine learning, which requires a lot of maths and statistics, and maybe only few people can use them and have been not really very successful explaining those artificial neural networks. And in neuroscience, there is this old idea of, well, neurons are feature detectors, right? I mean, I know that there is maybe in the neuroscience community skepticism about it, but what is appealing of these theories is, as I said, that they are very manageable and intuitive. And I'm just showing here the classic experiment that neuroscience that you record a neuron and you try to find a stimuli that make the neuron fire a lot, right? And then you end up saying, well, this neuron is a phase detector, right? So you can do exactly the same in artificial neural networks. This paper appeared in 2013 doing this. And you go to one of the early layers and you see that the neurons seem to be tuned. What I'm showing here, these blocks of 9 images, are just the 9 images that stimulate the most specific neuron, right? And you see that this neuron seems to be tuned to this kind of vertical gratings, no matter what color they are. This is another neuron tuned to kind of curves, neuron tuned to constant orange color. Then if you go later, in layer 5, this is a simple neural network just with 7 layers. And layer 5 is close to the end. You start seeing, a neuron tuned to dogs, neuron tuned to flowers, and so on, right? So that's a core idea in neuroscience that you actually can easily translate to artificial neural networks. And maybe another concept around it is that those neurons in later layers become become tuned to objects thanks to this compositional structure of the different layers, right? So every layer pulls across different neurons in the previous layer, and then is capable of detecting more and more complex features, right? So this is, I think, common knowledge in neuroscience. Machine learning was not so common until recently, but it's this building up on those theories seems to be a reasonable thing to do. Okay, so just now I'm gonna be I'm gonna explain one project that we recently finished that we use those techniques, right? And maybe just to wrap up, and as I said, this is for neuroscience, it's very common, for machine learning less. We are going to be just using techniques from neuroscience, psychophysics, electrophysiology, but in this case, to study artificial neural networks. Okay, and before starting into more research topic, and less philosophical one, I just would like to thank sponsors, collaborators, and my team. It's been really a great journey to work with them, and I'm really thankful to partner with them. Okay, I'm going to be talking about this recent project that we completed. It's in a topic that is of great concern for neural networks, which is about how dataset bias affects neural networks. Can they overcome bias? And if they can, how do they do that? And as I promised, we are going to be using neuroscience to do that. And before maybe starting into that, just note that there is, in neuroscience, well known, there is the ventral stream, the dorsal stream. I know that this is quite rough and it's very general and old school type of seeing things, but I just want to emphasize that the brain can not only recognize objects, but also can recognize their position, the viewpoint in which the object is, right? And that's what we are going to be studying here, how these two problems interact with each other in case that there is bias. Let me be more concrete. So imagine that you have this, the problem in which, given an image, you want to say what's the object category and what's the pose of it. Like you see here different cars, different airplanes, buses, etc. They are quite easy for a human to recognize, and they are at different viewpoints, right? And we can all easily say what is the orientation and the category of each of these objects, right? And machine learning algorithms have been claimed to be really good at it, as long as there is no bias in the training set. So we took some data sets in which we precisely know the category and the orientation, and we have been doing controlled experiments to understand how bias in the data set affects the accuracy of the neural network. So we can do something quite straightforward, which is, in this case, I'm just showing this grid, and in the data set, training set, we remove part of this grid. Right? So some objects only appear in some viewpoints. And then at testing, they will appear at different viewpoints. So this is just a schematic of how the data set is constructed. Then, for example, for a car, we might collect hundreds of images with a car in this viewpoint, right? But this is just a schematic that in the data set we are going to build of thousands of images, cars are only going to appear in these 3 viewpoints, and they will never appear in these other viewpoints here. So we can force the data set to have a bias, right? So we are doing a controlled experiment in order to figure out how bias might affect the network. And by doing those control experiments, we can get at underlying factors of the experiment that can affect the neural network in ways that maybe they were not expected, right? Note that in machine learning, the common approach is, well, let's go internet and let's collect a lot of data, and then with all this data, let's train a neural network on it, and then we keep a little portion of the data outside the training set, and then we test on it, right? And then we 95% accuracy, we came, okay, great, victory, right? But in those cases, we don't have insights about if the neural network is actually learning what it's supposed to learn, or maybe it is learning some biases, maybe learning using some shortcuts it shouldn't be learning, right? So by doing this, we are trying to control the data sets so that we can make sure that the neural network, if it's generalizing, is because it's actually identifying the car and not, or the object, and not because of some other aspect of it. Okay, and because here, as I said, we have 2 different tasks. We want to recognize category and the pose, right? We can actually play with the different architectures, right? That's something you can easily do in simulation in artificial neural networks. We can have in one architecture, we can just put the image and process all the image for both tasks, for predicting category and pose. Or we can have two different branches, one for category and one for pose, or having a little bit shared at the beginning, right? That's kind of what we would say it's more brain-like, right? Like sharing a little bit. And then we can see if this has any impact, right? So you can see these are quite simple experiments, right? But we're trying to get at the abilities of neural networks in this setup. We also collected some data sets for doing this with computer graphics. Again, here control is very important. And I emphasize once more that this is a bit the opposite of sometimes what you see in machine learning, which is about collecting data, and maybe not understanding what's going on in the data set. First experiment I'm showing here is what would happen if you test in category and viewpoint combinations that the neural network has seen during training. These are images that are not included in the training set, but the category and viewpoint of the object is known, is familiar with. And you see here 2 lines. One is for the network in which it's completely shared, and the other is when you split the 2 tasks, the category and the viewpoint separately. And this is no surprise here, like the 2 lines were very similar. That's what people in the literature has seen so far. Maybe a little bit of advantage when you put them together, when there is a little bit of sharing, because the 2 tasks maybe have something in common and they can help each other and so on. And another aspect here important to see is the percentage of sync combinations, what we call the data diversity. In this case, as more data diversity, the accuracy seems to be dropping, right? There's also no surprise because it means the data set has more complexity, there are more objects in more different viewpoints, so the neural network has maybe a bit more difficulty to figure out all the different patterns. And now we go to the key experiment, which is about what happens when you test in category viewpoints that the neural network is not familiar, when you test in the you are asking the network to overcome biases in the training set. And that's where we got some surprises. So first of all, you see the blue line, which is the one for separated architectures, to be much higher than the red line. So here I want to emphasize much because it's about, in this case, there is a gap of 20%. In machine learning, that tends to be a lot. If you read machine learning papers, usually you see improvements of 2 or 3%. But here, the gaps we have been seeing, not only in this data set, but in many data sets, were really, really big, 20 to 40%. Right? And that has been consistent across many different data sets we tested. So this architecture seems to be having something important for overcoming data set bias. And the second thing we observe, which is these are good news, is that as you increase the data diversity, as you move to this axis, you have more and more combinations. The network is capable of overcoming data set bias. So these are good news because neural networks seems not to be just stupid machines that memorize what they have seen in the training set, but they can actually overcome biases, right? As long as we do the right thing at training time. Okay, so we were excited to see the results. As I said, we reproduced these in other data sets. Here I'm just showing 3 more, and you can see sometimes the gap between these 2 curves is really, really striking. At the beginning, when we observed this, we thought, well, that may be a bug. The entire literature is talking about this may be the best. Why are we getting such a big boost of accuracy when we separate it? So we were quite excited when we realized that that's a consistent result we observe over and over different data sets. And we also can do a bit more fine-grained experiment in which, rather than having them tasks totally joined or totally separate, we can just put a little bit of the network together and then keep increasing that, and then we see this nice, smooth transition towards low accuracy and keep and the accuracy increasing towards higher accuracy as you separate more and more and more. So it seems separating, it seems this idea of having two modules separate seems to be helpful for overcoming dataset bias. And then we wanted to get at explaining that, and then when we went and said, okay, let's put electrodes to the neural network, artificial neural network, and do recordings in it, and try to apply some of the concepts in neuroscience to try to explain what's going on. Right? The first thing we did is, well, we have two tasks here, so there may be neurons specialized for one task and other neurons specialized for the other. So you might have some neurons that are helpful for detecting poses, some other neurons for detecting categories, right? And what I'm showing here in this grid is just a schematic, a toy schematic of how those neurons will look like. In green, it means very high firing rate. So every cell here, every grid, so this is a grid, and it corresponds to one of these category viewpoints combinations. And in green, it means the neuron is spiking a lot. You take the average firing rate for image in that cell, for objects in that category viewpoint combination. And if the spiking rate is very high, I draw here green. And if the spiking rate is very low, it's white. Right? It's just a toy schematic, right? And a neuron would be a pose neuron, a neuron that is helpful for recognizing a pose is then if that neuron spikes for that pose, no matter what category is the object, and vice versa, right? If the neuron is a category neuron, if it spikes consistently for the same category, no matter what pose is it, right? You can, as you can imagine, you can track neural activity from the artificial neural network, and then for every neuron, calculate a coefficient that says, okay, how much this is a pose neuron, how much this is a category neuron, and then you can plot a statistic, right? Common business in neuroscience, let's do it in machine learning. And I'm showing here a similar plot as before, but now with a percentage of neurons that are category or pose. And first of all, let's focus on the blue curve. This is for when you have this type of architecture, which the category and the pose are totally separate. And these are these two lines, the blue lines. And in one case, you have the percentage of neurons that are category or percentage of neurons that are pose in crosses. And what you see is that when you focus on the category branch, most of the neurons rapidly become specialized fully to category. Just with few data diversity, all the neurons are actually working and trying to detect category. And the same for the pose branch, just with a few percentage of data diversities in combinations, most neurons become 100% of them specialized to detect pose. Well, when you have them shared together, that takes a bit more data diversity, it takes much more effort. So it seems that in order to have those neurons specialized for one task or the other, data diversity plays a key role, and also having the module. So if you already, in the architecture, you force the network to separate the two tasks from early on, just manually forcing the two tasks, the two branches separately, the neurons become automatically specialized to the task they should be doing. Well, if you don't do that, then the neural network needs to figure out, well, here there are two tasks, they are actually two different things, I should not be confused with a bias, and that takes much more effort and data diversity. So that somehow started explaining a bit the result we saw before, right? So we are, by having this architecture, we're forcing the network to have this architecture, we're actually helping overcoming dataset bias by letting the neurons become specialized to what they should be doing and not to pick shortcuts in the data. And then you can do more fine-grained analysis. I will just be quickly explain this very quickly, but you guys are probably familiar that you can calculate some coefficients of how selective are the neurons to categories and pose, and how invariant they are to the nuisance factor, right? So again, this is most of the things that we do here. We just take it from neuroscience papers, and these are techniques that have been applied to interpret and understand biological neurons. You do the same, and we get to a score called specialization score, which is nothing else than how invariant and selective are the neurons to the task, the relevant task that they should be doing, and you end up finding a clear relationship between those properties of individual neurons and their final accuracy out of distribution. So to overcome dataset bias. And I'm just showing here, for example, in the case of category recognition, and the different colors are the networks more together or more separate. The blue is the totally separate, and you can see that it's the one that the neurons have emerged more invariant and selective to the respective factors. And one application out of this would be, well, now that we know that this selectivity and invariance, we understand some properties that should emerge in the neural activity. These properties seem to be very helpful for overcoming bias when we don't create some technique that forces the network to develop those mechanisms much faster, right? So that's another cool thing you can do with artificial neural networks, which now when you train the neural network, you can encourage the neural network during training to get to those mechanisms much faster. And as I said, invariance is one of those critical ones, and invariance is nothing else that, well, if you have, for example, in this case, I'm just putting here illumination. You have two images with different illuminations. If you want to be resilient to illumination changes, it would be helpful to have neurons. The neurons that detect this object would be helpful that those neurons are invariant to illuminations. So during training, we can ask the neural network, we can just, very easy to do, by mathematically adding this constraint during training. If these two images, the neurons that are spiking for those objects, should spike in the same way, should be invariant to them. And as we have seen before, the evidence we have is that when that invariance emerges, the network is capable of overcoming bias much better. If you do that across data sets and so on, you see actually an improvement in terms of overcoming dataset bias. And maybe one last result, here, OOD accuracy, here is what in machine learning field means overcoming dataset bias, this regime I've been speaking, that's the kind of the jargon of the field. And SI score is this metric I've been describing about individual neurons being selective to some objects and invariant to some of the nuisance factors. And each dot here represents a different neural network in a different data set of the many we have been tested. And we see always this clear correlation between these selectivity and invariances in individual neurons and the ability of the neural network to overcome data set bias. So it seems that there is a clear relationship with this, and that's something that we are quite excited to see those mechanisms emerging in the So just I'm going to wrap up here. So maybe the main three takeaways is that, well, good news. If we have a data set with enough data diversity, well, we can actually overcome data set bias. The second one, and that's maybe to us the most exciting and surprising, is that it seems that the architecture of how you architect the network has a lot of impact in overcoming dataset bias. Modules or separate architectures seem to be really, really important for that regime. And we were able to explain that by using techniques from neuroscience, looking at properties of individual neurons. Yeah, and just one more, thanking all the collaborators and contributors and colleagues, sponsors, research and other projects, and also thanking the organizers of this Congress for the amazing opportunity to be here and to present here this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are open for questions. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering, for example, right now in Twitter, 5 minutes you spend in it and there's so much DALL-E or stable diffusion, like examples of visual generations. But then again, it is suffering when you want to generate a visual of handshake and it just has difficulty adding like 3 hands. Or with DALL-E, like you can generate op-eds for New York Times, but at the same time, if you ask like, should I kill myself, as it's more cooperative, it says you should do it. So I was wondering, as you kind of mentioned it, that the diversity of data is really important, but like combinations of multiple AI models are also kind of like a solution, or do you think it's more data equals more success?
So the answer to this, that's a wonderful question. Like, okay, in practice, how do we get at addressing this problem? The point I'm trying to get here is that we need to do science around those models. It's not just about trying to find solutions, but I think we're going to get to the solutions if we understand their biases, understand the factors that affect bias. So I think we should take this approach more seriously to solve the problem you are pointing at. It's not just about technological problem, okay, what can we do to those techniques to address all these issues they have? I think without a theory around them, I don't think we are going to solve it.
Other questions? I have a question.
I had a question as well. So,
Sorry, please.
Sorry.
sorry, Petia.
Yes.
Well, thank you for such an inspiring talk. I am just wondering, because you are mentioning that these neural networks are inspired on the human brain, no? So all these things are inspired on the healthy human brain. So do you think that these networks could also learn from how brain reacts to disease, or how brain reacts to plasticity or to other things that we commonly discuss here? I don't know if this makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I think, of course, these artificial neural networks should provide a framework for testing hypotheses for neuroscience. That's a little bit, well, I don't have the slides here, but I think that's a bit maybe the more classical approach in which you can use these artificial neural networks. You can simulation, you can do experiments, test hypotheses, and so on. They are, of course, simplistic models of what's happening in biology, but they capture maybe important aspects of it. It can help you maybe rule out some hypotheses. You don't need to maybe do the experiment with humans or in the wet lab. You can just maybe do some tests with simulation. So I think it will play a role, but if you're asking me, well, is this the solution? Well, I think it's probably a component towards the solution. And hopefully it's going to be getting more and more weight in the neuroscience field.
Okay, we have one question from the audience. The question is, do we have a way, from our online audience, do we have a way to track the knowledge in neural networks? Affect having a specific path in the neural network that represents a particular kind of knowledge, for example, a blue car, would be helpful to have a sort of knowledge tracking?
And definitely, I think these theories of based on neuroscience, I think they can help us develop that. As I've been showing you some toy examples in which you have neurons spiking for dogs, neurons spiking for flowers. You can keep scaling this up. In my group, we are creating tools to do that more easily. That's definitely the way we think we should go. At least we truly believe in that by using those techniques, we are going to get to some understanding of the knowledge that neural networks are using or have.
And let me go with my question. Okay, if we think back, so you saw there is strong parallelism between artificial and natural and neural networks, but it's kind of simplification, right? Okay, we have neurons, we have layers, but today we have very excellent ways to see how the brain works, and here we saw excellent talks using EEG, using fMRI. We don't know only that what are the paths, but we can have a lot more information about the networks that are working in the brain. So don't you think that it makes sense to use all this kind of knowledge to make the deep learning networks more intelligent, not just having a bunch of layers and train them in a bottom-up way?
Yeah, of course, I truly sympathize with this approach, and I didn't show today any research about this, but that's also part of the things that we do to get insights from the brain and try to bring them to neural networks. For example, I talked today about the modules, right? And in the brain, clearly there are brain areas specialized to different things. Usually in artificial neural networks, that's not the case. You just put everything into one neural network. So these ideas are really inspired from that. The thing that we should be cautious about is that, well, maybe in the brain there are many aspects that we need to be aware of. Maybe they are not critical for intelligence. Maybe they are for sustaining life. Maybe they are epiphenomenal. So sometimes just going and say, okay, I'm going to just try to reproduce everything is in the brain, that might be not the right approach. I mean, of course, with infinite resources and ability to do that, of course, ahead. But given the challenge of the problem, it may be interesting first to identify which are those key aspects that actually lead to intelligence and reproduce them rather than trying to reproduce everything, because maybe we are just reproducing a detail, maybe something that is epiphenomenal, something that is just to sustain life and it's not really critical for intelligence. That's, I think, the main risk of that approach. Some people summarize this with, if you want to understand what are the principles of flying and you look at birds, I mean, yeah, you can go and reproduce the feathers, right, and spend all your life reproducing feathers, but at the end of the day, you're not going to fly. You want to get to the underlying principles, the wings, the air, etc. Right? So what are the feathers? What are the wings in the brain? That's a big question.
And in this line, to go a little bit further, in neural networks, we simplify the problem of classifying, categorizing birds and cars, but in real life, we are reasoning, right? We are extracting causal information. We are making inferences. We are deciding and explaining things. So,
definitely, yeah. We have the ability of asking questions, not just solving one individual task. We can actually see an image and answer many, many different questions without the need of being trained to each of those questions, right? Yeah. How do we do that? How to reproduce these machines? These are things that are still a challenge nowadays for machine learning.
Yeah. Any other questions? If not, we have a coffee break now. And at what time are we back? In 15 minutes?
Half an hour.
In half of an hour. We will be back in half of an hour.